Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said he might not attend the UN climate conference in Scotland in November. Mr Morrison told the West Australian newspaper that he wanted to focus on dealing with COVID, adding that he had already been on a lot of overseas trips this year and spent a lot of time in quarantine. Well, earlier I spoke to the former Australian Foreign Minister Alexander Downer about Scott Morrison's attendance at the COP26.
From his point of view, it's a 20,000 kilometre trip each way, a 40,000 kilometre round trip. It's not as though he's coming from Paris or Berlin. It's a huge commitment of time, and his attendance would be symbolic. I mean, and the symbolism may be important. And in the end, he probably will go because there will be such controversy about him not going. But you can understand why he emotionally is thinking, well, I go all that way. I'll announce what Australia's commitments are going to be, but we're going to announce them anyway. I don't have to be there to do that.
I suppose if the world's leaders are coming to this, Joe Biden will be here, it's being hosted by Boris Johnson. Isn't it critical then for Australia to attend?
Well, I think if he didn't come, he would be much criticised for not coming. Of course, it's not critical in the sense it's not going to make any difference to the outcome of the meeting. So we've got to try to separate virtue signalling and the optics of events from the substance of the events. And the important thing at the COP26 meeting is going to be the substance that comes from the negotiations, and whether the Prime Minister's there isn't going to make any difference to that. However, he will be criticised if he doesn't go. So my guess is that in the end, he'll probably think it's the lesser of two evils to make the 40,000 kilometre round trip.
And when, you've been engaged in politics for decades, and when a leader says something like this, is this testing the waters to see the response and reaction? Because he hasn't said he's not going, he said he may not go.
I think it's just likely to be how he feels having just arrived back from the United States and having to go into quarantine. And he's been to Asia on a couple of occasions fairly recently, and equally he has to go into quarantine when he goes back to Australia. And the Prime Minister can't exempt himself from quarantine without that causing huge community uproar and unpopularity. So my guess is that it's just a feeling he had. But when he thinks it through, he'll probably come to, I could be wrong here, but he'll probably come to the conclusion that the pain of criticism for not going is just not worth it.
The air miles.
That might be better to do the 40,000 kilometre. 40,000 kilometre return trip plus 14 days quarantine when he gets back, all to make a speech for like 3 minutes or something.
But it is, as you say, symbolic. And Australia and this particular government has been criticised for its climate policy, hasn't it?
Well, I think a lot of that is just partisanship, to be honest. Since 2005, let's just get this into some perspective. Canada and New Zealand are hardly ever criticised. Yet since 2005, Australia's CO2 emissions have reduced by 20%. Canada's and New Zealand's have barely declined at all in that period of time, but they have centre-left prime ministers, and so, a lot of the criticism comes from the centre-left, so they don't get criticised, and Australia has a centre-right prime minister and government, and so it does. But, I think, it's tough for Australia because of the structure of its economy. For some countries, it's much easier. There's much less pain involved in reducing CO2 emissions than for others. And for Australia, it's very hard going, very expensive, very costly in terms of societal disruption and jobs. And yet we have reduced our emissions by 20% since 2005. So we have done the hard yards more than, say, New Zealand or Canada have even tried to do.
Let's talk about AUKUS and this submarine agreement between the United Kingdom, the US and Australia. Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, has said that Scott Morrison's decision to cancel the submarine agreement with France is deeply flawed. Do you agree?
No, I think the decision to go along with the French submarine in the first place was a very strange decision and was always likely to cause problems. So the fact that it has ended in tears doesn't surprise me at all. The fact is that Australia uses on its existing submarines, which were a Swedish design, but uses American technology substantially. Some of that technology is extremely sensitive. Australia can't share that technology with France. And yet having the French build the submarines and building French submarines using that technology creates a huge complication. So the alternative to use American and British nuclear technology for the submarines to be stealthier, to have much, much longer range in the Indo-Pacific region, it makes good sense. What didn't make such good sense was choosing the French submarine in the first place.
That was Australia's former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer speaking to me there a little earlier.